You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we are back for another fun episode of Creationism 101. We've had such a fine reaction to previous episodes. I don't know how we got viral on that first episode with all the skeptics coming in to voice their disapproval, but hey, cool, great. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for boosting our numbers and our exposure. So maybe it'll happen again this episode. I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah. So previously we talked about basically why, as Christians, we young age creationists choose to read Genesis the way we do. And I think we laid out a pretty complicated set of reasons that are a bit more than just we read the text literally. At least we tried to do that. And then we had a nice episode where we talked about kind of Creation Week as a whole. Talked a little bit about why the days are laid out the way they are. And we talked a little bit about, whether there's gaps or whether they could represent long ages and all that sort of business. And of course, remember, this whole series is designed to help our viewers and listeners and audience members, whoever you may be. We're just sort of trying to lay out kind of an outline of what creationists think about things as a way to sort of make sure that we're not losing anybody. Paul and I have been at this for a very long time. We easily lapse into technical jargon like you just can't imagine. And I know that can make for a show that's very, really impenetrable to people, right? So if you're kind of new to this, if you're young, or if you're just never really thought about these issues and you're coming to a show like ours, I don't want you to get turned away because we're going on about what the Septuagint is and you really don't understand or care or any of that sort of business. Or we're going on about helium atoms, or we're going on about stars, starlight and time, all of those fun issues. We want everybody to find a way into the world of creation. And once again, this is an episode that's got a lot of notes, so you'll be seeing both Paul and me looking away from the camera a lot. So that's what we're doing. We're checking our notes here to make sure we don't forget things. So today we're going to talk about the days of creation, the days of creation in Genesis 1, and we're going to make some comments on how creationists have read the days of creation in the past. And I'm talking about, mostly 20th century people in my lifetime kind of creationists. And we'll give a little bit of commentary here and there about what we might think ourselves. Not too much. I don't want to make this, our personal soapbox. But we will mention things that we think have kind of fallen out of favor with mainstream creationism. So all we're going to do is basically just read through chapter 1 all the way through, I think, the beginning of chapter 2 there with the entire Creation Week. And we'll talk about the different pieces and different things that are created and that sort of thing. And we'll kind of go back and forth here and comment on what we're seeing in the text. Now, one thing that I think is important before we get rolling here is this question of, do we read the text literally, right? So I think that there is some that's a fair accusation at times, that we tend to read the text maybe too literally. And maybe creationists tend to think, young age creationists tend to think about the text as if the writer, the author here, was using very precise language to precisely represent very precise ideas that correspond to things in precise terms. And it's often said, usually in criticism to young age creation, but it's often said that the Bible is not a science textbook. And that's quite right? So when I think about the language of Genesis 1, I don't want to get caught up in the trap of thinking of it in terms of kind of precise definitions I would find in a modern biology textbook. I think it's very easy for us to start getting hung up on exactly what this word means and exactly what that word means, and kind of lose track of the context on one hand, and also lose track of the way people talk and the way language works. So we're going to point those kinds of things out as we go through here. And I don't know if Paul's going to really hammer on this, but I'm going to hammer on, let's not get too caught up about the precision of the way the language is used. Anyway, So Paul, can you get us going here with the opening day one, as we've already mentioned, day one of creation?
Sure. Well, let's read the text. So
right.
I'm going to read the first 5 verses. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. Now, we've already talked about this sort of beginning of Genesis chapter 1 quite extensively, I think, in the previous episode where we talked about Creation Week. And one of the things that we sort of pointed out there is that the creation of the heaven and the earth were probably part of the first day of Creation Week. They were not something that preceded the first day. And we also noted that the final words here, first day, should actually be translated one day or day one, because the text seems to be defining for us what a day is. You know, there's this period of light and a period of dark called day and night, and the evening and the morning are day one. That's literally what the text says. But I also want to note here that the word day is used to refer just to the light period of the day. So I think the word day has the same kind of range of meanings that the word day has in the English language. It can mean a whole 24-hour period, the whole sort of evening and morning together, or it can just refer to the period of light that we call day as opposed to night. So that's sort of one observation, just to add to what we said in the previous episode. And then another thing that I think is worth sort of highlighting here is the use of the word created in verse 1. That's the Hebrew term bara. One of the interesting things about that Hebrew word is that it's only ever used with God as its subject. Only God can bara, only God can create. And in this first chapter of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, that word bara is used in 3 contexts. It's used here in the passage we just read concerning the creation of the heaven and the earth. It's also used when God makes the flying and the swimming things. And it's also used when God makes human beings. So those are the 3 times it's used in Genesis 1. Now, it's also used in chapter 2. In chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, God's work in Creation Week is summarized, and the word bara is also used to refer to that creative activity. Some people have tried to tie the word bara, the Hebrew word create, directly to the idea of ex nihilo creation. That's a Latin expression. It just means creation from nothing. And so some people have suggested that the word bara, whenever bara is used, it means creation from nothing. I'm not sure that's exactly what the word means. For example, when we read about the creation of human beings, we've already said that the word bara is used there. But we know that Adam was created from dust. Eve was made from Adam's side. So neither of those events were ex nihilo creation. God was using pre-existing materials, if you like, to create Adam and then to create Eve. So it's not directly sort of referring to ex nihilo creation, but it is something that only God does. One other thing that I think is worth mentioning here, and again, we kind of touched on it, I think, in our episode on Creation Week, and that's the question of where does the light come from? We have here the creation of the light. God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. But we know, of course, that the sun is not created until the fourth day. So where does the light come from? Here, on the very first day. And I think the Bible does actually address this, not here directly in this passage, but elsewhere in the scriptures. So, for example, we have Psalm 104, which is a kind of poetic commentary on Genesis chapter 1, on creation. And in the opening couple of verses of that psalm, the psalmist says this: "Bless the Lord, who covereth thyself with light as with a garment." So the psalmist seems to appear to understand that the source of the light is actually God himself, clothing himself with light. And then we have another interesting reference in the New Testament at the end of the book of Revelation. And we talked, didn't we, about all of the creation references that there are in the book of Revelation. And there in Revelation chapter 22 and verse 5, we have this reference to the New Jerusalem having no sun because God is its source of light. So I think we can sort of take from those passages that the biblical answer to, where did this light come from in the beginning before there was sun, is that it was somehow directly from God himself. So those are a few thoughts on those first 5 verses, Todd.
And I think it's also interesting, if I can throw this in too, when Moses spends time in the presence of God receiving the law, comes back down into the camp, what's going on with his face?
Yeah.
It's glowing, shining. Right? It's glowing because he's been in the presence of God. I think that's really cool too. So there's something about God that manifests light. I don't know what that means. I don't know how it works, but you definitely see light is associated with God throughout the text of Scripture. So there it is. The great mystery has been solved. The thing that so many of the church fathers stumbled over for so many years.
Yeah. So how about day 2?
Yeah, day 2. So here, let me read that text for us. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day." Okay, so Paul, you know this very well. This passage is got a lot of different readings among creationists, and a lot of different readings, I think, among exegetes as well, actual Bible scholars, right? So I would say, looking across young age creationism today, that the most common reading would understand this to be that the firmament entails the entire universe. It encompasses everything. So everything from the surface of the earth to whatever is out there at the, edge of the universe. And that there is water beyond that. This was kind of made popular, I think, by Russ Humphreys. We've had Russ on before. And his white hole cosmology that he promoted in the 90s. And I say that's the most popular. I don't know that it is. Maybe if you actually did a survey, you would find out that the most popular is the old canopy theory, that there was a water canopy around the earth after creation, and that canopy then was the thing that collapsed and was the source of the floodwaters. We've dealt with that in a previous episode, so I'm not going to belabor that here. We'll just make sure we link to that whole episode in the show notes. But basically what we've got here is a situation where that doesn't really hold water, literally. The canopy model, the physics of it was sort of worked out in the 80s, and it just doesn't. To keep it up there, it would have to be not liquid. It would have to be very thin. It just doesn't work. And don't even get me started on solid canopies. Yeah, that definitely doesn't work. This is kind of important, I think, especially as we think about creationism in the context of other evangelical readings of Genesis 1, because it's become quite popular, I think. It's certainly very trendy. Let's call it trendy. Maybe that's the least insulting way for me to describe this. But trendy to think of the firmament here as a hard dome. So we've been told for a number of years now by a number of biblical scholars that the Bible teaches that the earth is essentially flat and that there's a hard dome, the rakia, as it's given in Hebrew, and that's translated as firmament, and that thing is the hard dome of heaven, and then the sun and the moon are inside of that dome. And then the stars are actually in the dome. And beyond the dome are these chaos waters that come gushing in, flood the earth during the flood. And this is ascribed to various ancient cultures. They have this idea that this is how the universe is made up. And I mentioned already this word rakia in Hebrew. That is the term that's translated firmament in the King James. It's translated expanse in other more modern texts. And we're told that rakia is just a hard surface. And you know me, Paul, I'm a scientist. I got to go look at the data. So I looked it up, right? I looked up how many times is rakia used, and is there text where you can see that the rakia must be a hard surface. So here's what I found. Rakia is used 17 times in the Old Testament. 9 of those times are right here in Genesis 1, so that's more than half. So if you're looking for contextual clues from other passages to help you understand this, it's less. It's less than the actual word used in Genesis 1. We're going to find that a lot as we go through here. Anyway, yeah, most of them are certainly outside of the context of Genesis 1, which I would say I don't know that there's any clear demand that it must be a hard dome in Genesis 1. It occurs twice in Psalms, once in Daniel, and 5 times in Ezekiel, in his visions recorded in chapter 1 and 10. The Psalms and Daniel usages don't really give us any clue about whether it's a hard surface. The closest I think I could come is there's sort of a reference in Ezekiel 126 where the throne is described as above the firmament. But again, does that mean the throne is sitting on a hard surface of the firmament, or it's just situated above the firmament? I don't know. And then Ezekiel 10:1, there's described a sapphire that's in the firmament. But again, does that mean that it's set in the firmament like a jewel in a piece of metal, like a piece of gold, or is it just that there is a sapphire in the firmament like there is a person standing in the fog? I don't know, right? I don't see much here from the usage of rakia that would demand that this thing be solid. Now, rakia comes from the verb raka, which means to spread, and that is definitely used of solid objects. But again, I'm not sure how that translates to, or that, means that the object of raka, whatever I'm spreading, must be a solid thing. I'm sure there's more to this argument, and I know there have been, in fact, at least one book that I can think of that's been written on this subject. So maybe we should come back to that someday and talk about the rakia. That's actually been an idea in the back of my mind for quite some time. So yeah, we're probably going to have to do that. As I said, although among the creationists, there's not a lot of agreement, I would say the simplest way to read it, I think, is to understand it as clouds. I think the ancients understood that clouds are water. They understood when there were dark clouds in the sky, that was when the rain came, and they would experience times of fog and notice that it's wet. So I think they would realize that those puffy white things up in the sky are clouds, the water's above. So maybe this was just a description of clouds. I don't know that really does justice to this sort of dramatic separating of the waters below and the waters above. So I don't know what to say. And I should point out one more thing here. This isn't really a major theme among creationists, but it's really an interesting feature that God does not say that any of this is good, right? That's an important part of the formula in most of these days, that God saw what he made and it was very good. He said that of the light on day 1, and he's going to say that about many things as we go. But he doesn't make that judgment here. He does not say that what he's made on this day is good. I don't know why. It's kind of curious. Anyway, so yeah. Any thoughts about that, Paul? Anything you want to add?
Well, we should definitely come back, I think, and do an episode about this idea of this sort of three-tier cosmology.
Yeah.
And, the whole sort of way that we understand rakia. I think it's very dangerous to look up the etymology of a word, in other words, where a word comes from, and to look up the verb raka and say, well, that refers to something that's hard, and therefore the word rakia must refer to a hard surface.
Right.
That's a very dangerous thing to do.
Yes.
Because
etymologies often have very little to do with how it ends up being used.
Exactly. So I think that's a leap that we should probably avoid making. Yeah. So we should come back and devote a whole episode to that. The other thing I'd say is I'm not sure that Russ Humphreys was, he certainly popularized this idea that the firmament is the whole expanse of space. I'm not sure he was the first to propose that. I think there were others before him, who had proposed something very similar. But I think it certainly became more popular in creationist circles once Humphreys had made it that part of his cosmology.
Right.
So anyway, very, very interesting. Well, shall we come on to day 3?
Yeah.
Day 3. So I'm going to read Genesis 1, verses 9 to 13. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day." So we've got a couple of things here, haven't we? We've got the origin of the dry land, the separation of the land and the seas, and we've got the creation of the plants on the land. So let's think then firstly about the origin of the land. That phrase, "let the dry land appear," I think creationists have discussed exactly what that means. Does it mean that the dry land was somehow directly created? Does it mean that the dry land already existed, that there were previously existing rocks that then appeared from under the surface of the water? And I think that's the implication of that word "appear," that they were kind of underneath the water, and when the waters were gathered together, the dry land appeared. And in recent years, certainly creationists have begun to understand this as a geologically significant event, perhaps involving some kind of process, perhaps the uplift of the continents and the sinking of the ocean basins to produce the continents and the oceans that we still have in the world today. And creationists have often appealed to this uplift of the land on day 3 as an event that would have left behind lots of geological activity that we might be able to discern in the rock record. And so creationists have often looked at some of the Precambrian rocks, the rocks that probably precede the beginning of the flood, and have attributed the origin of some of those rocks to the uplift that happened on day 3. And I think that's an enormously that's another subject for a whole episode. It's enormously complex. Creationists have a wide range of different opinions about how exactly some of those most ancient rocks kind of tie together with Creation Week, the pre-flood period, the early flood, and so on. Far too complex to get into here.
Yeah.
But
sounds
just
like a
to say
question
that,
of flood boundary also, right? So
exactly, a question of where does the flood begin? We've already sort of tackled the end of the flood, but we haven't thought much about the beginning of the flood. So there's lots of complexity here, but basically it does look as if there's some event where the dry land is uplifted from below the waters, and that probably has some kind of geological significance. And then we've got the clothing of the dry land with the plants, the creation of the plants. And what we have here is the first appearance of this very important phrase, "after its kind."
Yes.
Which, as you know, great significance in creationism, and creationists have been extensive discussions about what exactly this means. This phrase, after its kind or according to its kind, is repeated throughout this chapter. Every time God makes something alive, apart from humans, interestingly, we'll come on to that. And of course, it's become, for modern creationists, the source of this idea of the created kind or the Genesis kind. Or if you want to coin a new expression, the baramin.
Right.
The baramin, a rather clumsy kind of rendering of the Hebrew for create and kind, because of clumsily combined together.
Right.
To make this word baramin. So the literature, there's huge literature. What does this mean? What is this created kind? Some have tried to say that God created things to reproduce after their kind. They kind of tie this idea of kind to reproduction. But really the only place that you get even a hint of that here is in verses 11 and 12, where God creates the trees that yield fruit or seed after their kinds. But when you come to the animals, which are created later in the creation week, we don't really have any reference that sort of connects reproduction to this idea of kind. It's simply they're created according to their kinds. And it's not really connected to reproduction. So that's an interesting discussion. What does that mean? So what are these kinds? People have speculated for a very long time about the nature of the kinds. Are they to be identified with some sort of taxonomic category? Are they species? Are they families? Are they genera? Should we be trying to tie them to a particular taxonomic category at all? Is it just a kind of vague term that just means sorts, kinds, types? Biologists, when they began to sort of really study and understand species, became quite skeptical that species were fixed and unchanging. That was even before Darwin, although, of course, when Darwin came along, obviously he gave that idea of species transformation or mutability, a huge boost. But people were already thinking that species are not fixed and unchanging. So what are these kinds? Well, I mean, if they do correspond to any kind of taxonomic category that we're familiar with, it's probably not a species, and it's probably not as big as something like a class. A class would be reptiles, birds, mammals. It's probably somewhere in between species and class. It's, it seems to be somewhere in that range. But it's very difficult to sort of pin it down, at least as far as the strictly biblical usage goes, because kind isn't used all that often. It's used here in Genesis 1. It's used in like the dietary lists in the Old Testament, but it's not a word that's used very commonly, and it seems to be used in different ways. So it's hard to know exactly what the Bible means by the word kind. I'm sure you've got some more things to say about that, Todd, in a moment. But whatever these kinds are, we definitely see here the creation of what we would regard as advanced plants. So we're thinking of the flowering plants, what we refer to as the angiosperms. And they're created here at the same time as the dry land. So the dry land is uplifted, and then we have the creation of these advanced plants. And we referred last episode to the way in which, people have tried to say, well, the order of events in Genesis chapter 1 really matches the order of events in the fossil record. And we said, well, hang on a moment, not really. And this is one of those places where we really don't have the same order of events, because if you go strictly by the fossil record, then first of all, the first land plants would not be angiosperms. They wouldn't be flowering plants. They wouldn't be trees with fruit. And the flowering plants would appear much later in kind of geological history. So really, this doesn't correspond to the order that we have in the fossil record. So those are just a few thoughts. Todd,
yeah,
you've thought a great deal about this idea of kind. How do you reflect on this passage?
Oh, mercy. Yeah, I agree. The trick with Genesis is going to be the repetition of after its kind, and the way it is reflected in the creation of humans where it's substituted with in his image. And we'll get to that here in a second. So I tend to think it can't just be all kinds of things. It's something else, but I don't know exactly what the author is thinking of here. So I think it's fine for us to talk about Behrmans and created kinds, and because I think we can argue for that without appealing to the created kind concept. I'm sorry, the actual word for kind. But I do think it's good to be very careful about how we describe what that actual word means, because it's, as you say, used very rarely. It's used in the creation account, it's used in the flood account, it's used in the kosher food laws, and then I think it's used maybe one more time in the Old Testament, and that's it. So that's not a lot. And everywhere, almost everywhere it's used, it's talking about this animal after its kind, that animal after its kind, over and over again, or this plant after its kind. So yeah, is this like Hebrew biology, or I don't know.
Right.
Let's go on to day 4, a little better, little more clear stuff here. So I'll read this from Genesis 1. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the 4th day. So this, I mean, in Genesis 1:1, we had God creates the heaven and the earth, right? This is really the only passage we have of the rest of the universe being populated with stuff. And it's pretty thin, right? It's very much focused on what these lights mean to us here on the earth. The creation of the heavenly lights, they're given the job of marking time. The sun marks the day from the night. And then they designate, the seasons and the years and so forth. You'll notice the sun and moon are not mentioned by name. And we said that's important because they're worshipped as deities in Egypt. So here they're not just demoted to the 4th day of creation, but they are not even given their proper names. Now the stars are curious. Now, back when we interviewed Bob Hill about astronomy, you might remember that episode, we mentioned that all of astronomy is sort of reduced to the phrase, he made the stars also. And that's a gag I heard from Danny Faulkner, who is the astronomer at AIG. After that episode aired, after that episode was made public, we actually had a comment from one of our audience members that said that's not quite right. That in fact, if you look at your KJV Bible, you might note that he made in verse 16 is italicized. And when you see italics words in your KJV, that's a signal that those words aren't literally there in the original text, that those words have been added by the translators for clarity. So technically, the entire reference to the stars is "and the stars." Ta-da! And you could drop that out and you would have this in English: God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. So the question there is, and the stars, is that part of what the lesser light rules? So the lesser light to rule the night and the stars? Or do you see sort of the description of the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, as kind of a parenthetical statement to help you understand the 2 great lights? So that it could be read, God made 2 great lights and the stars. I have no idea. I just know, if you're looking for biblical astronomy, good luck. There's not a whole lot here at least in Genesis 1, to draw on. Some folks who are not young age creationists might see this, I should say, as a description of merely the visibility of the sun, moon, and stars, that for some reason there was a thick cloud cover or something that prevented the direct visibility of these astronomical bodies from the surface of the earth. And so this is just a revelation act. And I'm going to appeal again to Exodus 20:11. God created, in 6 days, God created the heavens and all that in them is. So I kind of take Genesis here, the fourth day, to be referring to the actual making of these heavenly bodies. Otherwise, not a lot to go on here, other than the purpose of these lights. Obviously, the sun lights up the day for us, and then the stars and the moon and the sun all mark the passage of time, which is rather important, as we'll see in lots of other passages in the Old Testament. But that's it as far as day 4 goes.
You know what strikes me is we're doing a series here, Creationism 101, but actually as you look at these very familiar passages, you begin to realize how little you actually do understand them, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how
That's
complicated they are to understand, in fact.
Yes, definitely.
Yes. So, in one sense, a child can read this passage and totally get it, totally understand it.
Yep.
And then scholars can delve into all of the complexities of this passage, and we haven't got to the bottom yet.
Right.
So, yeah. Let's come on to day 5. So day 5 is described in Genesis 1, verses 20 to 23, which say this. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. So what can we say about this? Well, here we have the first recorded creation of animal life. Again, notice, not following the order of the fossil record, because in the fossil record, animals already existed before there were plants on the dry land, which we've just seen, as described earlier in the account. So not following the order of the fossil record here. Now, what are these two groups of animals that are described here? We have this reference to creatures in the waters. We have reference to creatures flying in the air, and I think that's basically how we should understand them. They are flying things and swimming things. That's what these words mean. Some people get very worked up. I'm sure you've seen this, Todd. It comes up all the time.
Yes.
Why does the Bible include bats among the birds in Leviticus chapter 11 and verse 19? Doesn't God realize that bats are not birds? This is contrary to modern taxonomy.
Yes.
This shows that the Bible is incorrect. And again, I think what people are forgetting is, as you said at the beginning, the Bible is not a science textbook. It's not using these words in the same technical, precise sense that we use words as scientists. So when we have this word fowl or birds, sometimes it's rendered, that is not equivalent to the taxonomic category of aves today that we understand of as the birds. They are not the same thing. This is simply a word that just means things that fly.
Yep.
That's all it means. So bats and birds are included. And one other thing I'd say is that our technical taxonomic category birds actually includes things that don't fly. It includes things that swim, like penguins, and it includes things that walk around on the land, like ostriches, as well as animals that fly. So what this word means is just things that fly. And it could mean, of course, then that other things that we call birds are actually made on different days of the creation week. It could mean that some of them are included among the land animals. Another thing just to notice here is that, again, these flying things and swimming things are created after their kinds. We also see the first command to the animals to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And of course, that raises an interesting question about how many of these things were created in creation week. I think it's probably reasonable to infer that the plants were created in great abundance, covering the land. I think we can sort of draw that inference from ecological considerations. You need a lot more primary producers than you need consumers. So it makes sense that, plants were created in great abundance. But how many individual animals were made? How many of the flying things? How many of the different kinds of swimming things? The text, I think, is not clear about that. I think the implication seems to be that they're made in numbers, because we see this reference to the waters bringing them forth abundantly. But they clearly didn't fill the earth, because they're commanded to multiply and to fill the earth. So there seems to have been at least some room left for them to expand and to grow in numbers. Yeah, so we have the creation of the flying and the swimming things. Any thoughts on that, Todd?
Yeah, I would say I think a lot of creationists, and certainly I did in my younger days, we kind of imagine the initial creation of animals in pairs, just like Adam and Eve. There's an Adam and Eve of every created kind, and I don't know why, other than we just assume that that's how it worked. But I don't think we have any reason from the text here to assume that is precisely how those creatures would be made. All right. Well, day 6 is a big one, so I'm going to read through Genesis 1:24 to 31 here. It's quite long passage, and then we're going to maybe tackle this together. So here we go. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat, and it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Okay, so some repeat themes that we see here. We have the creation of land animals according to their kind. We've seen that before. We have a number of different categories, or descriptors, I think is the better term. We have beasts of the field. We have beasts of the earth. We have creeping things. So presumably here, I'm looking at all these different terms, and they're kind of describing different categories, I guess, maybe, or at least different ways that animals get around, or different ways that they make their living. They're domesticated, or they're wild, or they're little creeper creatures. So I would say take that to mean all land animals. And then we have creation of humans, which we could go for many, many episodes on this, and I'm sure we will have some in the future about this. You may remember we've already had an episode on the image of God, for example. We've had a couple of episodes on the fossil record, the human fossil record, so we'll definitely link those in the show notes for those of you who want to go deeper into that subject. Now, one of the things that we should note here, we have God is addressing someone as he prepares to create. He says, let us make man in our image. So the standard Christian interpretation, which I think pretty much all creationists would affirm, young age creationists would affirm, is that this is God speaking to the members of the Trinity. And I can't think of anybody in young age creationism who would argue with that. And then we have, of course, people made in God's image to have dominion. They're made male and female in that role. And we already mentioned briefly that humans are not made after their kind. They're made in God's image. And within the text, then you see that in his image is kind of performing a parallel function here to after its kind, where all the animals and plants are made after its kind. Humans are made in God's image. Now, as I said, I think that makes after its kind a little bit more important than just he made all sorts of things. Sort of a casual way of describing that. But at the same time, some people want to make this into some sort of Platonic category of in the mind of God, where he had this pattern and then he made these individual kinds. I don't know that that's in view here, but I don't want to just write off after its kind as being all sorts of creatures. I don't know what the happy medium between those, reading into some sort of Platonic way of reading Genesis 1 and just seeing it as a casual reference to all kinds of things. There's something in between there. I think that's probably the correct way of doing it. Now, we've had an entire episode on the image of God. Let me just briefly say, some Christians have understood the image to be kind of qualities in human beings that set us apart from the animal creation. Others have more recently argued that the image is a position that we hold as God's representatives on earth. I think that both of those positions have some merit to them. I think if we're going to be an effective representative of God in creation, we need to be like him in some way, and we need to have attributes that set us apart and even above creation. And I would say most modern young age creationists, I think, would take the quality view and say that the image is referring to qualities that set us apart from the animal creation.
Yeah, so let me just jump in here to talk a bit about dominion. You mentioned dominion there, that people made in God's image have dominion. And we've already said there are a number of words that are used in Genesis 1 that we only find rarely elsewhere in the Bible. Rakia was one, kind is another. Mm-hmm. And here's another one, dominion. It's that Hebrew word is only used 27 times in the Bible. And it's always used to refer to someone who rules over something. So like a king rules over his realm or over his dominion. So that seems to place human beings in this position of ruling over creation. And creationists historically, I don't think, have had very much to say about this, although it is a major theme in the description of the creation of human beings. But I think the point here is that we weren't simply made because God wanted to make us. He did want to make us, but we were made with a purpose. We were made to rule over, to have dominion over his creation. And one of the things that's quite interesting here is that we see a contrast with the creation myths of the surrounding cultures in the ancient Near East. So take Mesopotamian myth, for example, where you commonly read that human beings were created in order to do things for the gods, to be slaves to the gods, to provide the gods with food or to work for the gods. There's that kind of idea. But here in Genesis, people are made to rule over the rest of creation, over the works of God's hands. People are made to exercise dominion. And of course, that raises a question. What should that look like? What kind of rule should we rule with? And I think if we're made in God's image, then our rule should look like God's rule. Okay, we should reflect that. What does that mean? That's probably a very complicated question. There are a number of ways I think we could think about it. But one way to think about it is to say that it ought to be an unselfish rule. We read, don't we, that the greatest commandments are to love God and to love our neighbour. And love means that we put others before ourselves. And so I think, ruling over creation has to, in some fashion, mean taking care of the things that God has made. It's to exercise wise stewardship. That's what dominion means. Now, we don't want to get into all of the politics of exactly how that plays out in culture. What does it actually mean to care and tend and steward the things that God has made? That's not a topic we're going to get into here. But I do want to make the point that dominion does not mean the kind of selfish, exploitative plundering of God's creation, which is how I think certainly many non-Christians have seen it. They've said, you Christians, you believe in dominion, and that means you just think God's creation is there to be sort of just plundered. You can do with it what you like because you're the top dogs. And I think there are Christians who have misunderstood that that's what dominion means. But that's not, I think, what we see in Scripture. We're to rule as God rules. We're to care for the things that he's made. We're to exercise wise and loving stewardship of the things that God has made, not to be exploiters or plunderers of God's creation. So,
yeah, I think that's a
there?
really important point that you make there. This idea that the image and likeness of God is linked directly to dominion, right? Yeah. So if we're God's representatives, if we're supposed to show creation what God is like, then we should not be just tearing through it and using it for whatever we want to. That we need to be thinking about how God is ruling, and then that's how we need to be ruling.
Yeah.
Good point. But yeah, let's avoid the politics. All right. So then the last thing we see here is this gift of plants for food, right? And it's a gift that's given to both human beings and to the animals. And I would say a lot of creationists today, a lot of young age creationists today would read this as meaning that there are no carnivorous animals created initially in creation, that all of the animals were given green plants to eat, and that there were no animals hunting other animals and killing them. And I would say that also factors into some creationist arguments that there is essentially a form of animal immortality along with human immortality prior to the fall. Now, we'll probably get into this more when we get into the fall. So I'm just going to make that observation here. I don't know that this passage, I don't think this passage can really hold that entire argument by itself. So there are other verses that are found in other places in Scripture that factor into this, and we will definitely get into that in the future. But I also want to point out, this position, this idea that creation is initially completely herbivorous, is not consistent with some significant theologians in church history. I'm thinking here especially of Augustine. But as I say, there's more to it than just this passage. I'm just going to observe that as we pass by. And I guess that brings us to our final day here.
Yeah. So that brings us to God's declaration that everything he had made was very good in chapter 1, verse 31. And then the seventh day begins in chapter 2. So let's just read the first 3 verses of chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. And just a few thoughts here. Of course, all of us affirm that God rests here not because he is tired. God is not like us. He doesn't get weary and, needs rest or sleep. The rest that he enjoys here is a rest of enjoyment. It's the cessation of his work, and he looks at the creation and enjoys what he has made. He sees this very good creation. And we see this theme throughout the Bible, don't we? We see the theme of God taking pleasure in the things that he's made, and we also see the things that he has made, taking pleasure in God. That the creation itself kind of rejoices in its maker. And that's really the kind of climax of the creation account. It's God and all of his creation together. And I think this day of rest also has resonances elsewhere in Scripture. There's a kind of soteriological, to use a theological word, a soteriological aspect to this that refers to salvation. I think of Jesus on the cross when he says, "It is finished," and then he gives up his spirit. And I can't help think of Genesis chapter 1, where God has finished his creation and then rests, that Jesus has finished the work of salvation. So I think there's that sort of resonance. There's an eschatological resonance. In other words, thinking about the end of things, the end of all things. We look forward to that time when we'll be with God in eternity. And that is the ultimate fulfillment of that Sabbath rest. We see that in Hebrews chapter 4, don't we? That there's this Sabbath rest yet to come for the people of God in the new creation. And of course, we have Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11, which we talked about a lot in our last episode, where the seventh day sets that pattern for the Sabbath rest, for that day of rest, that one day in 7, where we remember what God has done in creation. We remember the resurrection of Christ, and it's a day of rest for us as believers. So that brings us to the end of the creation week.
So let me throw one more note in here that's actually not in my notes, but just occurred to me as we were talking about this. That very good, when God goes through creation week and he sees things and he calls them good, and then when he gets to the end of creation week, he says everything is very good. I think that factors into some of the young age creationist argument that there's something special and unique about the original creation, the way God made it. And part of that is a lack of carnivory and a lack of animal death. Now, it's not obvious, and I have to admit, it is not obvious that is what's being addressed here. Whatever very good means, I don't know that it has to entail, animal immortality. But it definitely comes up when creationists talk about that original creation. When we look around and see animals dying and suffering in terrible ways, we think that's not something that would have happened in the original creation. So that's another important point to make. I often hear creationists talk about how the initial creation was perfect and appeal to very good. I don't know what perfect is, what a perfect creation would be. So that's a tricky business right there. I think people's understanding of what perfect might be would differ from person to person. And we should probably have an episode about that in the future, this animal immortality question. It is a common young age creationist belief. I think some form of this is in view in the text, but I admit that it is not a clear and obvious feature of what the text is saying.
I think the whole question of the goodness of creation and what that means would be an excellent topic for a future episode.
I think so, yeah.
Because there are different understandings of that, and I think some of them are problematic, and we could sort of pick our way through some of that. But that would be a fascinating discussion, I think. Definitely.
We could look into the history of the church as well as the current landscape of opinion on these matters. So, yeah. All right. Well, we're a little bit over time here. We always try to keep these episodes to an hour. Lately, we haven't been doing a very good job, but thanks for joining us. Do like and share this episode, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and visit our website, letstalkcreation.org, to find out how you can become a supporter of our work. And we thank you for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the UK by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.